tiny corners of space and time, scientists found unfathomable energy and mind-numbing mysteries. Mysteries that suggest we are all connected, that the physical universe is essentially non-physical. Time and space are just constructs of this non-materialness.
It's time to get wise.
Science creates the stories that we live by. And science has told us a very bleak story. It's told us that we're some sort of genetic mistake, that we have genes that use us basically to move on to the next generation, and that we randomly mutate. It's said that we are outside of our universe, that we're alone, that we're separate, and that we're this sort of lonely mistake on a lonely planet in a lonely universe. And that informs our view of the world. It informs our view of ourselves. And we're now realizing that this view of separateness, is one of the most destructive things. It's the thing that creates all the problems in the world.
It's time to get wise.
And we're now realizing that that paradigm is wrong, that we aren't separate, we are all one. We're all together. At the very nethermost element of our being, we are connected. And so we're trying to understand and absorb what are the implications of that. What does this really mean to me in my life?
Connectivity among all things is a basic constituent of the fabric of reality. It's very difficult to wrap your mind around that. But Erwin Schrödinger said, he's one of the founders of quantum mechanics, that entanglement, which is this idea of this connectivity, is not just a property of quantum mechanics, it's the property. It's the property of quantum mechanics that makes it very, very strange. And it doesn't seem to fit in with our ordinary world, our ordinary experience, but in fact it actually does.
But the great-great-granddaddy of wacky quantum weirdness is entanglement. If time reversal symmetry destroys the notion of time, then entanglement crushes our experience of space. Two objects, two electrons created together, are entangled. Send one to the other side of the universe. Now, do something to one, and the other responds instantly. Instantly. So, either information is traveling infinitely fast, or, in reality, they are still connected. They are entangled. And since everything was entangled at the moment of the Big Bang, that means everything is still touching. Space is just the construct that gives the illusion that there are separate objects. Are we far enough down the rabbit hole yet?
It's tricky. I don't know if you want to go there. You do want to go there? So, entanglement is space separated and time separated. One way of looking very specifically at the time separation aspect, it's much easier to do this with one individual rather than two. Because who are you better entangled with than anyone? It's yourself. It's your future self that you're entangled with, and your past self. So the experiment that I developed to look at this is we wire you up typically to look at skin conductance, but also heart rate and other parameters. You will sit in front of a computer screen and you press a button, and you know that 5 seconds later you're going to see a picture. It could be a very calm picture, or it might be a very emotional picture. And it's randomly selected by the computer immediately before it's shown. So when you press the button, the future is not yet determined. So you need real precognition in order to be able to jump into the future and get it somehow. So since we're looking at your physiology, we know what happens to physiology after you see an emotional image. And we know what happens after you see a calm image. The question is, does that future experience leak into your present? Does it happen before you see the picture? And through this experiment, you can see what happens. Electrical activity of the heart, EKG. This is photoplethysmograph, which is the amount of blood in the fingertip, and respiration, breathing in, breathing out. Press the button, well, what happens to physiology? Well, if it starts rising before the image appears, it may suggest that you're about to get an emotional picture. And if it stays calm, it suggests maybe you're going to get a calm picture. So we've done this kind of experiment for several hundred people, and colleagues have run this experiment as well, and as it turns out, that is exactly what you see. People become aroused before randomly selected pictures in the future that happen to be emotional, and they remain calm before randomly selected pictures that are calm. This has been seen in heart rate changes, in skin conductance, in the brain, and basically systemically throughout the body. We are entangled with our future selves.
There literally are different worlds in which we live. There's the macroscopic world that we see. There's the world of our cells. There's the world of our atoms. There's the world of our nuclei. These are each totally different worlds. They have their own language. They have their own mathematics. They're not just smaller. Each is totally different, but they're complementary. Because I am my atoms, but I am also my cells. I'm also my macroscopic physiology. It's all true. They're just different levels of truth. The deepest level of truth uncovered by science and by philosophy is the fundamental truth of unity. At that deepest subnuclear level of our reality, you and I are literally one.
This gradually led into some notions that there was an invisible connection between everything. Physicists give this a name. They call it entanglement.
As Einstein put it, he didn't believe that quantum mechanics could be true because it required that there be spooky action at a distance.
That's why Einstein hated quantum mechanics. I mean, he said exactly that. If quantum mechanics is true, then there is no more science.
Spooky action at a distance. That was his term. And what he meant is that when we have our ordinary sense of the way that the fabric of reality is, it seems like these two places are absolutely in space, they're separate, and never the twain shall meet. But in fact, it's not true. At some deeper level that we can't see with our eyes very clearly, two places in space are the same. They are co-located, coexisting. So if we imagine that common sense, the way common sense literally meaning that your senses tell you about the world, if that's the way the world is actually constructed, then things like psychic and mystical experience don't make any sense at all. Because the whole point about psychic and mystical experience that makes them strange is the sense that there's some kind of connection between what's going on inside your head and things elsewhere in space and in time. So what this view of quantum mechanics provides is a way of framing what these strange experiences are like. And it reframes it from somehow magically information is getting inside my head from signals or forces or something into a different view, which is that in a sense your head, yes, is here, but it's also spread out through space and time. And so when I'm able to get a telepathic impression from somebody at a distance, it's not because I somehow jumped out there and got it, but because at some deep level my head and the other person's head are co-located.
We become entitled all the time when we communicate telepathically. Those experiences are so striking. I literally can read your thoughts if I become entangled with you. And such things happen. There are distant viewing experiments. There are even experiments now that you are seeing light flashes and your brain potentials picks up the signature of those light flashes, what is called evoke potential, that can be measured in an EEG machine connected to your brain. And I am sitting over there, no light flashes, I cannot see you, and still my brain potentials, because I am correlated with you in terms of intention, I intend to be directly communicative with your experiences. That intention gives me the capability of simultaneously having the similar brain potential in my brain. It was first done by Jacobo Greenberg at the University of Mexico, and now repeated by Peter Fenwick in London.
So let's say you have interested in this notion of entangled minds, entangled bodies. How would you demonstrate that in the lab? The way that we do it is we take two people and we simply ask them to keep each other in mind. We entangle their minds by asking them to do so. Just keep each other in mind. It's the mental equivalent of a physics experiment where you're entangling people. Then you wire them both up physiologically. So you might measure the heart rate on both of them, brain waves, skin conductance. You measure what's happening physiologically. Then you separate them into two places so that no ordinary form of sensory leakage can pass between them. So they can't interact then anymore by conventional means, as is done in a physics experiment. And now you do the equivalent of poke one of them and see if the other one flinches. And if it turns out that you can poke that person and that person flinches as a result, or at the right time, that's a way of demonstrating that they are still entangled even though they are no longer in the same place. At the end of Entangled Minds, I take 5 or 6 classes of experiments that I've created or that I've analyzed to come up with a single number of the odds against chance for telepathy in the conscious state, in the dream state, for entangled minds and bodies, for mind-matter interaction, for those classes of experiments, which is roughly 1,500 experiments. And the overall figure is 10 to the 104 to 1. So that's a big number. I mean, at some point you have to say, well, the evidence from these experiments is so large against chance that chance as an explanation is simply not viable.
At a fundamental level that is even difficult to observe, there's one God self that is all of us. We grow from that. The whole universe grew from it, and each of the separate personalities that appeared have grown from it, with the illusion that each one is a separate individual, but actually we're all from the same tree.
Entanglement is a new idea because it's arising out of science, but the concept of a connected universe is as ancient as we know. I mean, like the fundamental principles in Eastern philosophy is that everything is entangled, but they didn't use those words. But that's basically what the models are from Eastern philosophy. So, you know, we have that as a historical basis for these kinds of ideas. It's called words like cosmic consciousness or collective consciousness. And the new part is that science, through very different means, has encountered this aspect of the world and is now beginning fairly rapidly, actually, to learn the nature of it. The reason why people are attracted to psychic experiences or mystical experiences is because they feel it has enormous meaning, like more meaning than usual, and the reason for that is typically a feeling of connectedness, a merging of your ego with something else. And why that should create this internal sense that it's important is not entirely clear to me. But oftentimes a single psychic experience can be life-transforming.
We are entangled. If you want to call it quantum entanglement, fine, but we are entangled. And there is no real separation between us, so that what we do to another, we do to an aspect of ourselves.
Why do we not see the entanglement? Because evolution has pushed us to not see it. And we get quite good at not seeing it. You know, the sensory input is constructing this image of the world in which the things are separate. But we know through experiments, we know through experience that they're separate, but at some level they're not so separate after all.
We're finding non-locality everywhere, in our bodies, in space, from stars, in regions of the zero-point field. Everything is connected. And so we have this involvement in everything. We are our world. There's no out there. We are, there's no place where we end and everything else begins. We're all connected.
You take this notion of an entangled universe and you apply it to human experience, because human experience is part of the universe as well. And then you say, well, let's assume that experience is entangled, then how would it manifest? And we can start going through ways in which it could manifest. If there's a connection with another mind, we call it telepathy. If there's a connection to some other object somewhere else, we'd call it clairvoyance. If there's a connection that happens to transcend time, we'd call it precognition. there's a connection in which my intention is expressed out in the world some way. We might call it psychokinesis or distant healing or something of that sort. So you can go through a list of perhaps 12 kinds of psychic experience that have gotten labels over the years, like telepathy. But this is really just the tip of the iceberg.
I think entanglement and collapse in one system inducing collapse in another is exactly what happens in parapsychological phenomena. And it's also true that time can go backwards, so that they don't even have to be simultaneously. One can occur before or after the other. And near-death experiences, particularly when patients report leaving their body and floating above their bodies, watching themselves being worked on, and then return to their body, could be due to the fact that consciousness is ultimately a process in fundamental space-time geometry. And when the coherence driving the system stops due to the metabolic insult to the brain, the information is still in fundamental space-time geometry, which is everywhere. So it would tend to start to dissipate. However, due to quantum entanglement, would tend to stay somewhat localized and float above, maybe go out in the waiting room and visit with relatives, which has been reported in near-death experiences. But then when the body is resuscitated, revived, and the metabolic drive in the brain resumes, the information returns to its host, the brain.
We are all connected. I mean, I think the most fundamental thing is we're all connected by an energy field. We swim in a sea of light, basically, which is the zero-point field. And I say, first of all, you get away from the whole idea of separateness, because separateness is the biggest problem of the world now.
Whatever way we observe the world around us is what comes back to us.
One then begins to see others as part of themselves. One begins to see that it's best just to love others and not judge them. That what you do to build another actually builds yourself. You begin to see that you're connected, you're part of a large family.
Love of one's neighbor, I think, is based upon the recognition of neighbor as oneself. Ultimately, of course, when consciousness is developed and education is working, one will perceive other as oneself, because we're all one unity. There is only one consciousness, there's only one unified field.
Jesus' teaching, love your neighbor as yourself, was actually a teaching about the higher frequencies of the nature of reality. In other words, he didn't say love your neighbor because it's a good thing to do. Be nice to your neighbor and God will reward you. He was, I suppose we could say, practicing enlightened self-interest at its best, because what he knew that with the intent, which we call the observer in the quantum world, the intent of the observer towards another, what you express towards another, is what you create for yourself. So if you express love or hate or harm to another, you're creating it. And the prime beneficiary in all creation is yourself. So when he said, love your neighbor and do good to those who hate you and so forth, he was actually paying tribute to the role of the observer in everything that we do.
Well, one of the consequences of this entanglement issue is that every thought is received by every other person who can think. Our thoughts have action, have intentions, have consequences that spread out into the world. From a personal basis, my thought is a drop in the ocean. So probably what I think doesn't matter a whole lot. But if there are a billion of me, and we happen to be thinking along the same lines, it probably will be picked up and influence other thinking creatures. So in a sense, if this line of thinking plays out, then one of the consequences may be that we need to be more responsible for our thoughts.
We are all creating the future. We are all creating what is outside of us. None of us are innocent in that regard. There's something out there we don't like. We can't really turn our backs on it, because we're co-creators somehow or other. And we have to do the right things to try to get the future that is best for all of us.
All our separate consciousness, wherever there's consciousness, is merely consciousness by virtue of the fact that my consciousness, your consciousness, are ultimately that. Everything in the universe is really nothing but that. Planets, trees, people, animals, we're all just waves of vibration of this underlying unified superstring field. We are really united at our core. And ultimately the understanding that's emerging will be that there is only one consciousness in this room. And it is you. And it is me. And it is each and every one of us. We individualize our consciousness through the filter of our nervous system. But the consciousness itself, our very inner subjectivity, the self in the big sense, that is universal. And knowing that, knowing it through experience, is called enlightenment, and has been called enlightenment through the ages.
In the end, these were but tools to bring imagination into a quantum fury, a dream that sets its sights above the mundane and the mediocrity of life, that everyone can set their sights therein. Then we are no longer hated and despised, but we have done the one most excellent virtue. We have saved ourselves through simply applying our most excellent eternal ability, and that is that we are God, and that we call out of inertness, the wind-sprayed particles of chaos, and we freeze them for a momentary reality in which all predecessors and all successors agree upon, and now we have tangibility of mass. But we have brought it out of nothing. And how could we ever be nothing? We could never be nothing. It is only out of nothing that we have our being, but our being we do have, and we are ambitious gods.